You are standing beside the door, and the footsteps have not come, and you are a domestic duck, and the absence of the footsteps is the first fact of a new world that does not yet know it is a new world. And you wait the way you have always waited, because waiting has always worked. The footsteps always come, the hand always fills the bowl, and the sun crosses the yard, and the bowl stays empty, and the waiting extends past the point where waiting has ever extended before. And you quack, because quacking has sometimes accelerated the footsteps, and then you quack louder, because louder has sometimes worked when quieter has not, and neither works now. And by afternoon, the biological equation that has governed your entire life shifts in the only direction available to it, which is toward finding food rather than waiting for food to arrive. And you are a domestic duck, heavier than a mallard should be, wings too small for comfortable, sustained flight. Instincts present, but wrapped in a life where almost every dangerous decision was removed before you needed to make it, and the garden contains things that are edible. If you look, insects under leaves, larvae in the puddle behind the shed, the particular richness of wet soil that your beak can probe. And none of this is the pellets, but all of it is food. And food is what the equation requires, and the next morning you remember where the larvae were. And this memory is more significant than it appears because the first generation survives by accident, and the second survives because it remembers, and memory is the foundation that everything else is built on. And within weeks, you find the pond behind the property, and the wild ducks scatter when you approach, and you follow anyway. Because the pond is water, and water is where ducks go, and the wild ducks carry information in their behavior that your domesticated life never required you to learn. The fox comes from the tree line. The hawk makes a particular shadow. The safest sleep is on the water rather than beside the house. And when one bird freezes, all birds should freeze. And you learn these things not because anyone teaches you, but because the birds around you know them. And copying behavior that keeps other animals alive is a learning strategy that does not require understanding what you are copying. The first winter is the filter that filters without mercy. The ducks too heavy to find enough food, the ones that still approach human structures expecting the old system to resume, the ones whose instincts toward open ground override the cover-seeking behavior that surviving a winter with predators requires. And what remains after the filter is the foundation of what follows, smaller and more cautious and less conspicuous. And conspicuousness is the first physical trait that selection addresses because white feathers in a dark marsh are visible from above. And visible from above is the variable that determines whether the hawk commits to the dive. And within several generations, white becomes rare in the population. Not because anything decided white was wrong, but because the white ducks were found more often. And finding means dying before reproducing. And dying before reproducing is the only mechanism selection uses. 10 years out, and the descendants living at the pond are already different in behavior from the duck that stood beside the door waiting for footsteps. They feed at dawn and dusk and hide during the brightest hours and sleep on water and raise young near reeds. And the domestic duck is disappearing not through extinction, but through the transformation that selection always applies when the conditions that shaped a trait are removed. 100 years out, and the population has spread along the river system, and different sections of the river are asking different questions. And the same animal cannot answer all questions with equal efficiency. The marsh birds and the river birds and the birds that pushed into the colder northern reaches that the domestic duck would never have survived without shelter, each being shaped by the specific demands of their specific habitat. The northern birds thicker in the down and more efficient in the metabolism, and better at the fat storage that cold winters require. The diving lineage that emerged from the populations spending most time in deeper water, becoming heavier and more streamlined in the way that water rewards streamlining, their eyes shifting toward the underwater acuity that finding food below the surface requires. Their nostrils developing the valves that prevent flooding during prolonged submersion. Their feathers so dense that staying dry has become structural rather than behavioral. 10,000 years out, and the word duck covers a radiation of forms that share an origin and share the basic architecture of the original bird, but are answering questions that the original bird never encountered. The island lineage where predator pressure was low enough that flight became a cost rather than a benefit has been losing the wings that cost energy without returning survival value and gaining the legs that return more in an environment where the food is on the ground and nothing that currently exists can catch a 10-kilogram bird moving through dense coastal vegetation. And the migratory lineage, following the river systems across continents, has been gaining the wings that the distance requires. Lighter bodies and longer wings, and the lung efficiency that sustained flight at altitude demands. And the roots are encoded now, rather than remembered individually. The behavior carrying the rote across generations the way behavior carries anything that survival consistently rewards, and the communication has become more specific as the predator community has become more diverse. Different calls for different threats encoding the information that allows the whole flock to respond appropriately to the specific danger, rather than to danger in general. Not language, not anything that requires that word, but functional specificity that changes behavior in ways that general alarm cannot. A million years out and in a wetland covering what was once a suburban neighborhood. Something moves across the water in the loose formation of animals that have been moving together long enough for the formation to be inherited rather than chosen. And one dives and then 10. And then the entire flock disappears beneath the surface and emerges 50 meters away, carrying the fish and crustaceans that the submergence located. And these animals are not really ducks in the sense that the word carried when a domestic duck stood beside a door waiting for footsteps. They are what the wetland required across a million years of asking the question and removing the answers that were insufficient, their legs short and powerful, their bodies shaped for water movement, their wings reduced but functional for the short flights that connect feeding areas. And 5 million years out, the radiation has continued past the point where any single description covers it, the inland lake lineage that lost flight when the lake removed the predator pressure that made flight necessary. Enormous now and grazing the coastal margins on legs that no longer remember what swimming felt like. The marine lineage that followed the fish offshore and kept following until the salt glands enlarged enough to make the open ocean viable, and the wings stiffened for the gliding that ocean winds allow. And strangest of all, the forest lineage on an isolated continent where the ancestral ducks, webbed feet, and ground nesting behavior were raw material for a direction that no wetland environment ever pointed toward, claws strengthening on feet that still carry the web between the toes, the bill shortening toward the leverage that fruit and insects require. The association with water persisting only as a preference for drinking near streams rather than as an ecological dependency, and 10 million years after the bowl stayed empty on the morning the footsteps did not come. In a forest that has been growing over a former suburb for long enough that the suburb is chemistry in the soil rather than structure above it, a young bird steps into shallow water and lowers its head to search beneath the surface. And a shadow crosses the water, and the bird freezes, and every bird in the vicinity freezes with it. And the shadow passes, and they resume feeding. And the freeze response that moved through the flock in the fraction of a second that selection compressed it into is the direct descendant of the behavior the wild ducks demonstrated at the pond when the domestic duck arrived and began copying what it saw. And somewhere in the genome of the young bird, there is still the sequence that once coded for the orientation response to human footsteps approaching, the alertness to the particular sound of pellets hitting a plastic bowl, the comfort response to a familiar voice in the morning, instructions connecting to nothing that exists in the current world. A fossil in the code from a life organized around a system that stopped one morning without warning, and the water moves around the bird's feet. And the forest receives the light through the canopy, and the bird feeds, and the story continues without anyone left to remember how it started.